Kia ora koutou. Once more for those at the back. We have two top scientists, Hayden Montgomery and John Roche, who is at MPI, but he's also the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. That's going to help us move into the how. So we'll look ahead to exploring how technology is set to shape not just what we do, but how we think about emissions. We'll bring it closer to home and get a rapid fire update on the tools and technologies that are currently under development here in New Zealand and what the path to adoption looks like in practice. Finally, we'll wrap up with a panel discussion focused on how we unlock the low emissions advantage for our sector. Now, one thing to keep an eye out for today is that Z Lee, who's a very talented visual facilitator, has been capturing the ideas from the conference in real time. You'll see yesterday's discussions brought to life, and today's insights will build alongside them. You can have a look just by heading out the back doors and going off to the left. Don't go now, but during the tea breaks, I went and had a look earlier, and it is really cool. It's a comprehensive visual feast of all the ideas that have been circulating over the last day and a bit. Now, we're starting with a live link from Uruguay, where Hayden Montgomery, who's the Program Director for Agriculture at the Global Methane Hub, is situated. He is a Kiwi, I believe, and he's going to talk about the criticality of science investment.
Thank you, and it's great to join from here, from afar. I am a Kiwi. I've spent many years working in the New Zealand government and around the research community. I would say I'm not a eminent scientist. I'd just qualify your introduction, although I appreciate it. But we're certainly a user of science and a strong supporter of science in the program that I lead in the Global Methane Hub. So we'll get straight into the slides. So please, next slide. My talk will focus on the largest single anthropogenic source of methane, which occupies a very large space within the Global Methane Hub agriculture program. Of course, enteric fermentation, which is, as we all know, one of the largest challenges New Zealand faces in terms of its climate response. If we go to the next slide, I just want to take this opportunity to present some visualizations, not to get into the weeds of the detail of the data, but to hopefully leave you with an impression of from our vantage point, thinking about enteric fermentation globally, helping us think where we need to be working and in what way we need to be working in order to make an impact to reduce those emissions. And I guess from my vantage point, a really good scenario would be that others do catch up to New Zealand, because that will mean we're actually on track as a planet to reducing these emissions. The first plot is just to show a bit of a composite index of pressure, right? So it's methane pressure exerted by meat production across the globe. And the red color indicates sort of high pressure and the greener colors indicate lower pressure. And the composite index takes into account animal numbers, relative efficiency in production, in the case of this, daily weight gain of these animals, and the emissions intensity as a consequence. And so it shows us that while there are some large emitters in, say, North America, the pressure in my terms at least, is different to the pressure exerted by other large emitters in, say, South Asia, Latin America, which isn't to say we don't need to act everywhere, but it's to say that perhaps we need to think of different strategies to begin in some of these different coloured circles on the map. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to show the same visualization for milk production, again from two ruminant species, right? So from cattle and buffalo, same as the previous. Again, to just demonstrate the pressure exerted by dairy production from cattle and buffalo on the planet, taking into account population of animals, relative efficiency and methane emissions intensity of those production systems. And this, for me, looking at our program strategy, is really at a high level very important to guide how we operate, right? So if we go to the next slide, I just want to set a little bit of context before diving into the tools and technologies part of the conversation. To borrow the same colors from the previous visualizations, The way we look at this is there are the reddish coloured blobs on the charts, previous charts, where the initial interventions need to be oriented towards raising productivity, reducing emissions intensity through measures like improved animal health, improved nutrition, and so on. These are the things one would logically or rationally start with, and then you would follow on by stacking in technologies and other interventions, which may not have benefits to the farmers, may be more costly, and would make no sense to start with when you have low levels of productivity. So this gives space for productivity-oriented activities to bend the curve, followed by the very important tools and technologies that we'll get into in this session. And if we go to the next slide, just to say a couple of examples. Well, first of all, the diversity of systems represented on those maps, okay? Livestock are not the same system everywhere. Obviously, there are systems of confinement, other systems of extensive management, different diet qualities, and so on. So next slide, please. A couple of activities we focus on, just to say we don't only do innovation and R&D. We do extension-oriented activities, knowledge, capacity building, and so on. You'll see these colours shaded here, hopefully, which kind of align with some reddish dots on the previous visualizations. And this is all about improving and optimizing grazing management, utilization of the pasture that's grown, managing it so the quality is maintained, and therefore increasing productivity, reducing emissions intensity. The next slide shows another example of more confined dairy production in smallholder dairy systems, characterized by parts of sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. Likewise, a nutrition-oriented intervention, building local feed libraries, addressing the yield gap through optimized nutrition for those animals. So just to say, we work on some broader things than just the innovation agenda. If we go to the next slide, I will introduce now our big focus on innovation, which is through an enteric fermentation R&D accelerator that we launched a couple of years ago, which is the largest globally coordinated effort on R&D to address this very large source of emissions. It's also an initiative funded by philanthropy, by governments, and by the private sector. And you may recognize some logos from representatives that spoke yesterday, and I was listening in from here. And we have the Government of Ireland, the Government of the UK as funders of that initiative, alongside a number of philanthropic foundations. If you go to the next slide, please. The approach we take here is consolidating philanthropic, public sector, and private sector capital into a fund that we then deploy in a strategy that we have developed with our science oversight committee that you can see here. These are scientists representing different disciplines, largely retired, so not in active research. And this cross-disciplinary group help develop our strategy, assess the state of the science, and then co-design the proposals or the projects that we ultimately fund. If we go to the next slide, you'll hopefully see it catch up. Sort of a delay. There we go. You'll see the strategy encompasses methane vaccines, methane inhibitors, low methane genetics, measurement tools, which is methane measurement, but also other key variables that might be relevant, low methane characteristics of feed as opposed to the feed additives themselves, the very important area of the rumen microbiome, and animal physiology and behavior, which is an area that's really important, but really, really underfunded in terms of its relevance to the methane agenda. If we go to the next slide, just to show you how we approach this, it's probably impossible to see from the room, but basically we are interested in technology readiness in these different research areas. And for us, success means accelerating progress up the technology readiness level, which for those who aren't familiar means from kind of discovery through to development through to deployment. And deployment, I mean, having been validated in real world conditions, ready for scaling. We want to accelerate the progress up that TRL scale across the research area. And in this chart, it's represented as a large range of TRLs because even within an area like, say, feed additives or methane inhibitors, you have a range of technological maturity of the different additives that are out there. So just to show you how we approach it and the kind of means by which we assess our effectiveness. And if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to whip through some of the projects. So, excuse me. Just a selection. So one is that we know there are challenges in measuring methane, particularly in grazing systems that are, prevalent and where overwhelming majority of ruminant livestock are being raised. We have supported the development of a wearable for livestock, starting with cattle, that would aim to monitor in real time and on a continuous basis emissions of methane, emissions of carbon dioxide, and also give some proxies around feed intake as a means to have a lower cost option available to go alongside the other technologies and techniques that exist, right? So respiration chambers, the sniffer techniques, the green feeds, and so on. So we see this as a necessary addition to that suite of tools, and we're making some really good progress, or the grantee is, ZALP Sense is the product name, making really good progress with expectations of having that product ready for use later this year. Next slide. Another one is really focused on measurement, but it's more on the data interpretation. So we know there are some challenges with how people interpret data derived from different measurement technologies. In this case, we've assembled a very large consortium, which has now been able to bring together more than 100 studies from 40 different research teams who have been using green feed to measure emissions in different settings and different treatments and different, for different reasons. But the main point is ensuring that we have clear operating procedures and protocols for how data should be interpreted to make sure we can actually draw some robust conclusions from the results, right? Emissions reduced don't always equate to, or emissions reduced or measured by the machine don't always equate to a successful mitigation strategy. We have to understand, given the nature of the technology or the technique, how to interpret spot measurements and turn that into reliable reductions. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a bit of a trend here, which is the kinds of projects we aim to fund tend to be large consortia type projects that are necessary for answering the questions we have. And because of the nature of the funding we have, we believe we're well positioned to do that, which is often a challenge for government funders or private sector funders to pull off because they have other requirements they need to get out of their funding. I'm not seeing the slides advance to the next one. There we go. So quickly, rumen microbiome, similar approach, more than 25 institutions trying to understand the diversity of the microbes in the rumen. And this one is focused primarily on isolating and culturing those so they're available for research. It's a foundational project of ours. It's led by Queen's University Belfast and a number of other collaborators around the world, part of the Global Research Alliance as well. And it's really about creating the data set that's accessible to science, whether that be researchers in the public domain or companies trying to develop solutions, and have those bugs available that they can then be utilized for assessing different mitigation strategies. If we go to the next slide, and I'm going to move quickly. Methane vaccine, probably a great topic of discussion there. We are supporting work on methane vaccine. We know there are commercial efforts underway. We are connected to most of those. Our work is trying to complement the strategies of those entities. So we are looking at things like how does the immune system and the rumen microbiome develop and evolve from early life, from birth, basically. We're interested also in how one can sustain an immune response in an animal to have ongoing effective mitigation. And we're also interested in the mechanism of immunity that are possible or triggered by exposing methanogens to the immune system of the animals. So these are projects underway, and they are adding value to the other efforts out there. And we're also actively considering how we can support the acceleration of proof of concept studies of the ventures that are out there developing vaccines. So we're dipping our toes in the water of the ventures as well, the commercial entities. If we go to the next slide, another example. This was announced last year. This is a very large project. It's basically developing an enormous reference population of animals of different species, different breeds in different countries that provides the basis for genomic selection for low methane characteristics of animals. Now, I need to say, because I always get people misinterpret, this is not about gene editing, GMOs, or anything else. This is just selection of the animals that have the desired characteristics. But it's creating a reference population of sufficient quality and size that enables us to do that through more modern technologies like genomics, which is, of course, a very reliable means of selection. and ensure that those traits relating to methane are part of a balanced selection strategy from industry. So this is a huge project, and accompanying that project is probably what will be the largest collection of rumen microbiome samples, certainly in terms of diversity, because it's collecting 20,000 of those from the different animals and buffalo, goats, sheep, cattle, etc. around the world. So it's a huge resource. And the next slide. I think this is the penultimate slide, just to say we're also conscious that there's some really cutting edge research which tends to be conducted in the advanced research organisations of the world. So we also want to make sure we are supporting the much needed capacity in other parts of the world that don't have the resources. And we're really pleased we're able to support initiatives like the Cliffgrad Scholarships, which is part of the Global Research Alliance, coordinated out of New Zealand there, by providing funds for up to 30 scholars to be part of this, basically to be hosted by the researchers that are part of our growing portfolio of projects doing the research that I've been talking to. So I think that's the end of my slides. I've got one more, which is a QR code, if that shows up. If anyone out there is interested to connect, we don't sort of have calls for proposals, but we are keen to hear what people are doing. So if people want to jump in and provide information, we're happy to look at that and make contact as appropriate. So I appreciate the time, and sorry if I went a little bit longer than anticipated.
Thanks, Hayden. That was an incredible sweep of science deployment around the globe. Hayden is going to stay online and take part in our Q&A, which is coming up very shortly. So if you do have questions for him, you still have another chance to get those in. Coming up next, we have John Roche beaming in from Ireland. He's pre-prepared a video for us, which is on farm leadership and innovation, an interview with project leaders. After that, we'll move on to our next two speakers and our panel.
Good morning. I'm here at the Teagasc Oak Park facility, headquarters of Teagasc, to speak with Dr. Frank O'Mara. So let's head on in.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. So Frank O'Mara is my name. I'm the director of Teagasc, which is Ireland's agriculture and food research and agri-extension and agri-education organisation.
Thanks, Frank. So in terms of greenhouse gases, what recent research breakthroughs or programs have shown the greatest potential to reduce emissions at the farm level, do you think?
Well, look, there's a lot going on, and I suppose we don't have any, magic bullet as yet. I think the things that are very interesting over the last couple of years have been our work to actually get more accurate emissions from our grazing dairy cows in particular. I think we have some interesting work coming through now on actually sequestration or emissions from our soils, emissions from our peat. We have a lot of peat in Ireland, as people will know. We're getting better quantification on that. I think, look, going back to the tried and trusted, efficiency really counts. We see that in particular. I suppose lifetime performance of beef cattle or better live weight gain is something where we think we can make progress. The additives, yes, there's some good work going on there. We still, I suppose, don't have an additive that will work from the point of view of efficacy in a grazing situation, or is cost neutral or at worst, or acceptable. So look, there's some good work going on in the additives in that space. So fertilizers, still work going on here in Ireland on fertilizer, seeing can we get some of our lower nitrogen fertilizers to have lower emissions. So obviously we're very much here in Ireland pushing the urea versus calcium ammonium nitrate as a solution at farm level. So look, lots going on, but it's still a work in progress.
From your perspective, what distinguishes farmers who lead on adopting these low emissions innovations from those that are slower to adopt them?
Well, look, I suppose, whether it's innovations around climate or innovations around performance or productivity, there's always, the early adopters. So I think it's the same early adopters that it would be interested in other technologies that are also interested in the technologies around climate. I think there are people, look, obviously, that take a strategic view of their business and want to make sure that they're future-proofed and therefore are always interested in seeing what's new and giving it a go.
Very good. How does Teagasc work with industry, government and farmers to accelerate the development and in particular the scaling and adoption low emissions technologies?
So we work very closely with both farmers and the agri industry. So whether that's on the industry side, the co-ops or the meat factories, we've got joint programs with all of those. That's where we would sit down, develop a program for the next maybe 3, 4, 5 years, and have joint objectives in that, and put staff, working exclusively on that program. And the targets in that could be around productivity, or around water quality, or around climate change, or whatever it might be, or quality. And so we have joint programs with actually all the major agri-food companies in Ireland. Some of them where they come together, so all the meat companies come together in one overall program. And generally a part of that involves having demonstration or monitor farms, or signpost farms as we call them here in Ireland. So they are farmers' farms. We work very closely with those. We use those for farmer to farmer learning, and hold a lot of events on those. So look, we have very good contact with our farmers, and it's through many ways. But those demonstration farms are a key part of it. Other parts, obviously, discussion groups and lots of events. I think we had somewhere like 500 farm events last year in the country. So look, we work very closely with the sector.
Fantastic, yeah, because farmers learn from farmers. What drivers do you believe are most influential in determining farmers' willingness to adopt low emissions practices, and what are the biggest challenges?
Well, look, the main thing is cost. It really is this going to cost money, or will it actually improve the bottom line? It's far easier to get things adopted, as you can imagine, where there's a positive contribution to cost. But look, having said that, farmers are willing to adopt technologies that might actually cost a bit of money if they save time, or if they make the operations more streamlined, or they can see some benefit to them. And look, a good example of that we had in Ireland was the low emission slurry spreading, which is a more costly way to spread your effluent. But it gives more flexibility in terms of where and when you can spread that, because you can spread it on, you can graze more quickly after spreading that than just, we'd say, putting it out on cut ground for after silage.
Fantastic. Look, thanks, Frank. Thanks for sharing this, and thanks for your time. And we look forward to continuing the collaboration.
Absolutely.
All right. So now I'm at the Moore Park Research Centre, and I'm about to interview a farmer, Kevin Toomey from Ballyhooly in County Cork, about greenhouse gas mitigations. So let's go on in.
My name is Kevin Toomey. I farm with my wife Margaret about 10 kilometres from here. So we're a spring grass-based system, typical of the Republic here. So farming well. I also chair the Blackwater Catchment Programme, which is just recently set up around water quality improvement in the catchment of the valley.
Fantastic.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Kevin. What motivated you to become an early adopter of low emissions practices, and how has that shaped your approach to farming?
Yeah, like some of it is very practical. Like certainly from our slurry spreading, we would have went from splash bed spreading out to less low emissions equipment, and that's worked really well, because there's definitely benefits of capturing some of that nitrogen that we were losing into the atmosphere that way. So it was a pretty obvious one. It's a little bit more expensive, so it did cost a small bit to move towards that. So other things about the protected urea, which we use as well. There are benefits definitely in terms of capturing some of that nitrogen we may have been losing in unprotected, particularly at different times of the year, towards the summer and drier parts of the year. So there's been benefits, but it does cost a bit of money to move towards these benefits. So, but it has been good.
Brilliant. What were the biggest challenges you faced when implementing new practices, and did the government subsidies or support help to manage any of those?
Yes, to be fair, the government probably did very early come in with grant aiding for the slurry equipment and less spreading, and so that equipment comes with a 40% grant aid for most farmers. So that was quite beneficial and encouraging farmers. And to be fair, the majority of slurry nationally is now put out through that system, which wouldn't have been regulatory, really, to be fair. So people have adapted it and saw the benefit of it.
So what innovations or opportunities are you most excited about that may come to the fore in the next 5 or so years?
I think, look, there's the bit around the whole methane. Can grass-fed cows at pasture, can we do better in terms of their emissions? That's definitely probably our biggest challenge, I would say, from an emissions point of view. So hopefully we can do it through a feed additive. Certainly some early research is showing that better quality grass is delivering and are producing less methane with the same amount of volume of milk going out. So that's good. Genetically, definitely quite a number of benefits there. I think we can get longer life cows, more longevity, and more performance, and more productive. And certainly early indications are certain genetics are more efficient than others, which we would have presumed that would have been the way, but there's probably significant gains over time in that space as well. So that's something that could happen very easily over time, because we're probably very good to adapt genetic potential in the national herd here. I think we've proven that before through
Absolutely.
our EBI system.
Yeah, it is low-hanging fruit. There's a proud tradition of it, so it's easier.
People are interested in that.
Yeah, and there isn't the same trade-off. So when you're breeding for efficiency, there's money in it as well.
There is, correct. Yeah.
And your peers, I mean, that you interact with, how has farmers' attitudes changed to this in recent years? Do you think there's more of a willingness to take up these mitigations?
Yes, I think there is. It has been slow, particularly the slurry went very well, that less equipment, that's worked really well. Timing of application has definitely improved as well, in terms of doing that at the right times of the year and the right weather situations, getting the benefit of that. I suppose the fertilizer has been a bit more difficult because of that nature, but that's going to improve again, I think, as well. Well, it has improved and it will improve now, because there's regulation around it, so we have no choice only to make it happen.
Has there been any reaction by Irish farmers to what the Danish farmers have found with the inhibitor they've used and worried about animal
Not
health?
really, because it's not been used here, really. So probably they're slightly aware, but not alarmed.
Right.
I think yes, because we're not in that space. We're not in that TMR mix where we can put that feed into the diet. So it's not really a short-term concern anyway.
Okay, fantastic. Look, thanks, Kevin, for giving us your insights there. Really appreciate it.
No bother at all.
Fabulous video from John there, proving that even methane mitigation sounds better with an Irish accent. And that there is money to be made, even if, in that farmer's words, it costs a small bit more. I thought that was really cool. Now, we are pivoting slightly. Now, we are going to be talking about the future and the advantages of tech in our farming systems. We've got two familiar faces waiting in the wings at the side of the stage. Cutting out a bit, aren't I? Brendan O'Connell, he's the Chief Executive of AgriTech New Zealand, and Melissa Clark-Reynolds, a futurist and entrepreneur. Please join me in welcoming Brendan to the stage.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. You've got a cluster of Irish accents. I apologise for being, number 4 in a row. The organisers should have had subtitles arranged maybe for some of us. I particularly loved the ending there, no bother at all. Very familiar. Pleasure to be with you. Look forward to some discussions. I think we're asking the wrong question when we're looking the way we're talking about technology at the moment. We keep on holding out for this sort of stream of new tools. And when we're talking about, which tools will unlock our low emissions advantage, I think we're missing the point that the constraint isn't really technological currently. The pipeline already exists. It is already full and it continues to flow. What our behaviors are around that technology is what becomes really critical and really important. I think the advantage and the context of the advantage we can find is a lot more about our changing attitudes, motivations, relations, and structures around what these new capabilities mean on farm. So when we look at, what the game, if we're looking for an advantage, what's the low emissions advantage in the particular game we're deciding to play right now? We know it lies in grass-fed production for New Zealand. That's an advantage. It's not unique, but it is an advantage against many systems. We know that our verifiable claims and trade access solutions is also part of our advantage in that space. Again, not fully unique, but important and a definite advantage in terms of how we operate. We start getting into some of the more true and difficult to replicate advantages when we talk about our science system. And I think some of the changes that are currently being made to the science system, when they settle and when the culture matches the strategies that are being put into place, this system's going to get even stronger. So I believe that is a real advantage for us, but I'll put some further context around what that fits within. When I see the type of collaboration that we've seen in AgriZero, we know how unique that is. We don't see enough of that. We've been able to do it on something as existential as livestock emissions. I think it's brilliant work that's being done to raise our capacity about doing that on a wider range of topics is really important as well. And that's when we start getting into some of the things that really are an advantage and are very different to anywhere else in the world. And even though we've seen some interesting years since COVID, and there's a little bit more polarization within our political system than there has been before, and we continue to suffer from the jandal politics or the pendulum politics or whatever we talk about, when you still hear people talking about what they view New Zealand to be, there is still a shared identity and a shared view. So that commonality is still to be treasured here and is not necessarily common in other parts of the world. That sense of national identity, that attitude. Alexander Hillary's session yesterday around, tenacity, and I think there was definitely something in there that is unique to the New Zealand culture and unique to how we can do things here in New Zealand. We just need to understand that number 8 wire is not something, as a thinking, it's not something that's an entirely positive thing. Yes, it's great to have ingenuity and to be really adaptable. It's no longer okay just to be making do with what you have in front of you. We need to be thinking of things at scale and impact that doesn't meet some of that number 8 wire. We'll get through it, Sham. So when I think about the games we're playing and we look at this, there was on that previous, I've moved past the slide now, but when we're thinking about the game we're playing right now, it's market access, it's market value, that's fantastic. We need to continue looking at what our advantages are, and if we're going to successfully navigate, there are things that are going to stay the same, things are going to change, and we need some honest assessments of which parts of that identity and practice are genuinely assets. This is some work that we did back in 2022 with partners at MPIs, Esprit, FAR, Dairy NZ, and the Fertiliser Association. It still stands. So this was part of work where we're looking at adoption motivations and barriers for digital technologies. As Franco Mara just said in his piece, the adoption behaviors and practices and mindsets are similar whether you're talking about emissions technologies or emissions tools as they are for any other form of innovation. He coalesced those two things. The behaviors are the same, the mindsets are the same. And something I think is really important to point out, particularly as an Irishman, is that I don't think that this is the same in the system and the ecosystem that Frank is operating in. I think what we're seeing here is a uniquely New Zealand characteristic, and I would call out that on the right side over there, that's 58% of the population are farmers. We talk about farmers adopting technology, of course, as if there's some sort of homogenous group, and they're no more homogenous than any other group of humans than even you guys are, although there has been a bit of sorting by the fact that you're even in the room. But 58% of the population are over on the right-hand side there. Trailblazers at 12%. In any other technology adoption context, you would expect early adopters to be about 5% of our population. To have that as 12% here is particularly interesting and particularly powerful. To have that sort of pragmatist, pressured view, sort of the fast followers, the persuadables, the pressured and pragmatist groups, I think we'd all recognize that in the attitude of a lot of our farmers and growers out there. I remember when I was working at a company that shall remain True Test, we used to have a product called the XR3000. It's a yellow box. I suspect a lot of people in the room will remember it. Over a period of about 15 years, it responded to every feature request that came out of the sector. And so it became a very powerful unit, but it was a dog of a thing to use. So much so that they used to call it the FYB, so the yellow box. And I can remember speaking to a farmer And he was trying to figure it out, and he was making his way through it. It was a difficult piece of gear because everything was just so embedded. And he turned around and he said, well, you know, it's like a microwave. If you're hungry enough for a feed, you'll make it work. And I think that type of underlying attitude is something that we can all identify in the population out there. And I think the behaviors and the attitudes that we see from our farmers and growers is unique to New Zealand. It does have something to do with our market approach, our lack of subsidies, the fact that farming is an absolutely professional activity and you can only survive in it by continuing to improve like any business. And that's not necessarily the case in places like Europe and in places of the world. So there's something precious there. Context of tools, I don't think I need to hark on this too long. Again, we look at them as being the shiny new things. They're going to solve anything. They're just levers, they're just tools. The farmer is absolutely the force, and there's many other things that have to be in place. Having reduced enteric methane solutions is not going to change the farm systems to take them. It's not going to change the reporting systems to prove the impact that they've been having. And all of that is work that has to happen in advance of them arriving. I think it's appropriate that we celebrate our farmers. They're an absolute national asset. I would say that our innovators are also a national asset, and one that we at AgriTech New Zealand seek to highlight. We heard yesterday from Richard Heath from Australia about the concept of technology stacking and the fact that things are adopted in bundles, and that's definitely the case. We're not working from a blank field here in any way, form, or shape. There's already many technologies in place that are growing and that are enabling foundational capacities to make sure that we're ready for everything that follows. And they will follow in a sequence. They will follow in certain bundles. And a lot of it is going to be driven by human and commercial conditions, not necessarily the existence or non-existence of a particular piece of technology. I'm really nervous about putting up the next slide because I know that there are scientists in the room. And so this is not what it looks like. This is not a marginal abatement cost curve. Much as I wish that we were talking about marginal abatement cost curves here and using them as a form of communication, because it cuts across so many decisions that have to be made and different connections between different types of technology. So first of all, I just name out sort of 3 different contexts of technology there in terms of the decision and informational stuff. The indirect tools, which can have a direct impact, they're just not necessarily having emissions printed on their label. And then obviously the direct ones, which is a large focus on what we're discussing here today. And in the depiction there, you'll see effectively moving from left to right, you're talking about ability to reduce methane, ability to reduce emissions and what happens with those practices. And then in the XY axis going up, it should be costs. These are not costed, this is indicative only. My main points here is that even when you look, we've got all our informatic tools, which are fundamental to some of the changes and some of the developments we need to be making, and they exist already, and we're seeing new behaviors in those space that I'll talk about. We'll see that we're already looking at good pasture management here, and there's capacity to do more. Good per animal productivity, and there's a path to do more. Much as Hayden showed that red line slope for some of those other nations, that red line slope exists for New Zealand as well, just because we're highly productive and we're highly professional at what we do. We have not had the productivity gains that we've had in the past, and there's still a lot of work to do to find those productivity gains, and the tools exist to do them. We just don't have wide enough adoption of them yet, of the existing tools that are available today. And so a lot of progress to do there, including new tools coming on in those indirect spaces. And then there's all the direct tools that we see coming through. And so it's not a blank slate. And it's not an empty field when you start looking at who's out there and what's already happening and already available. I think New Zealand should be proud that not only is it developing the Apple operating system of farming, it's also developing the Android operating system of farming when you look at 2 organizations like Halter and Gallagher and what they're doing. It's from my original home in Ireland. We do those comparisons. Ireland hasn't produced those type of companies in this type of context. New Zealand has. And then you look at all of the tools and operators in that space across the whole pipeline. There is a very healthy ecosystem and there is a very healthy level of activity that's happening here. We just need to look, are we being conscious enough about how it joins up and what happens with it? We talked about sort of human and commercial conditions. I'd like to call out two pieces or signals that I see as being pretty important and things that we should recognize and build on. And again, it's in the sort of the attitudinal space around how to go about doing things and how real change can happen. So both of them fit into this data space. This data is the new oil. And for years, many people in this room would have worked on me when we were saying about we don't have a data interoperability problem, we have a human interoperability problem. And that is no longer a fair accusation to cast because we're seeing attitudes change. On the left-hand side there, I call out the MPI's greenhouse gas calculator done as an open-sourced API that anybody can bring into their systems. To have a regulator that's taking an open data approach and enabling data collection whose context has changed as we move through different policy settings. But still we have a regulator who's using an open data approach to enable many to participate and enable what needs to happen on farm. Again, that's not what happens in my home country. There it is all being done through the Teagasc and Department of Agriculture, seen in a very closed environment, not being open to the innovations and the technologies that can integrate. New Zealand should be proud of that. It's a great step, and I celebrate what MPI has done. Again, we've had over a decade of talking about the lack of mobility in data. And yet over the last couple of years, we've seen more integration and more flow of data between different systems because of Fonterra's battle cry to remove 1 million compliance hours out of the sector. That's been a rallying call in a similar way that AgriZero has been a rallying call to change behaviors and see data flowing. I think that should be celebrated. We should be seeing more of it. We do have a very live and living ecosystem here in New Zealand across all of the capabilities that need to come together. And I would say that what's important here is that this is an ecosystem that's complete. It includes technology, it includes large agribusiness, it includes investment, it includes farmer-grower groups, it includes enablers and supporters, and of course it includes all of our science and research community as well. This is a living beast, a living organism that is fully contained in New Zealand. We have everything that we need to do these things, and it can have global impact. I think that is worth celebrating, and knowing that it becomes more and more important as we grow out of the era of some of the technologies we talk about being shiny things on the side to actually being key enablers and needing wider adoption. So I see a lot of what we see happening here as sort of, preparing the ground. When I first started in this sector 19 years ago, I was fortunate enough to meet Andy McFarlane, and he gave me a bit of a crash course of where technology fits, and he described farming as a game of limiting factors and limiting constraints, and that you're always looking at what you need to unlock next. I think that's exactly what we're looking at here. We're trying to look at being ready before new solutions arrive. We have continued opportunities to improve productivity, to get more per animal productivity going on. The choice that we've got is what do we do with those gains, and how do we have that? Where do we see that fitting? And of course, if data is the new oil, even in an oil crisis, you start thinking about, well, what does that really mean? Where are those potentials going to come from? We've started some good work in terms of the level of mobility that's out there, but there's a lot more work to do. So I think our advantage isn't just a set of current assets, it's a platform for selective adaptation as the climate context changes. Today and for the next few years, that can be market access and market value. That might change in the future, and all the same skills and the same community and the same type of behaviors are going to be required. In systems thinking, they say the subsystem with the most flexibility controls the system. I think New Zealand has fantastic flexibility and can continue building that muscle. One final point with my 1 minute to go on the signal there. Talking about AgriTech as a sector as well and its contribution here. We've been looking at doubling export volume of export value by 2034. There's a real opportunity to look at doubling our export value as well and recognizing what we've been able to create and the shared activities that have been necessary to create the type of technology outcomes that we've come. It's not a replacement, it's an interrelationship. In 2021 was the last time we had a real measure of the AgriTech sector. We know that some things were undercounted. MB and ourselves now look at the sector being somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 billion. We know individual cases of company growth that's happening in the high teens. And in fact, when you look at some of the biotech companies, it's even higher than that. So to think of 15% compound annual growth rate as a potential, it's already nearly happening. You extrapolate that out to 2040, and the agri-tech sector is bigger than the dairy sector is today. Now, of course, the dairy sector is going to, with responsible growth, is going to continue to grow as well. Our point is that New Zealand needs new options, and this is one of the areas that we can have new options. I'll skip that summary and just leave you with this question, or these three questions, because I think it summarizes where I've been going. If they did all arrive here tomorrow, would it actually change behavior, the tools, the same? There's so much else that has to change apart from the existence or non-existence of the tools. And would we on the upside? What's our relationship to these technologies? You look across AgriZero's portfolio and the New Zealand entities of those are going to return, the whole portfolio will return for AgriZero. Those companies return for New Zealand in quite a different way. So we have no other options. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. Extremely good to be reminded about the human piece in all of this, the behavioural changes that we need to get ready for the technology options that we actually already have or are soon close to having even more of. Also to be reminded that our farming community has more trailblazers per capita than you would expect, so that should give us some fertile ground to move forward. It's now time for us to hear from Melissa Clark-Reynolds. Welcome, Melissa.
Oh, te Māori mai tātou, mihi nui kia koutou. That's always an interesting one. You know, I'm sitting here and I just suddenly feel like an old fart. And I studied climate medicine at university in 1989. And I have this weird kind of double masters, so half in environmental planning and half in environmental epidemiology. And I was sitting there in that last session and I was thinking about, in 1989, it was absolutely drilled into us that this was pandemic century. And I remember writing a report when I worked at the Ministry for the Environment in the 1990s that said in 2022 Nelson would be underwater and we'd be in lockdown with a pandemic. And the pandemic that I had picked at the time was dengue fever. And the reason that I picked dengue fever is that back in the 90s we were doing everything you would do if you wanted to create a pandemic in the 2020s. And the two big things we were doing that were going to make that pandemic inevitable was that we were changing the climate in such a way that the insects that spread a number of diseases were just going to find the world a happier place. And so the reason that I thought we were going to be in lockdown is we were looking at NIWA data back then about wind patterns, we were looking at rainfall patterns, and Nelson just looked like the coziest, nicest place for mosquitoes from Australia to get blown over and for dengue fever to start. And I thought about this a lot as I was just sitting there this morning, because we were wrong about the actual pandemic, but we were right about the weather patterns, and we were right that, you know, we are continuing even now, some 30 years later, to keep doing the things that will make them inevitable. And then the second area that was in my report back then that was making a pandemic inevitable was what we were doing with animal agriculture in the 80s and 90s. And what we were doing is that we were expanding particular animal agriculture into habitats where those animals had not lived before. And so what we were doing is that we were ripping out rainforest in South America, we're doing the same in Indonesia, we're doing the same in China, and we were putting species together that had never been together. And I want to mention this because you can kind of look at me and you can see my DNA is from the north. No ko te rāna oku tupuna. So my tupuna came out here in the 1840s from Scotland. And if you have Scottish DNA, you're about 60% Viking, because the Danes occupied Scotland for several hundred years. And that DNA, encoded in my DNA, is thousands of years of people living in barns with their animals. And I don't mean that to sound creepy. I just mean that it means that my DNA has built into it a whole lot of resistance to a bunch of agricultural animal diseases. And of course, as we came out here to the Pacific, we thoughtfully brought those diseases with us, and we spread them into populations that didn't have that same 15, 20,000 years worth of resistance. And I mention this because when I first started tracking as a futurist and as an epidemiologist what was going on in China in 2019, my first email out to my clients was that the pandemic was a food safety failure. And I think this is an interesting kind of lens for us to start to also think, and I know like today I've been asked to talk about technology. I'm a technologist, I have this award for the Queen for my services to technology. Back in studying epidemiology in the 80s, I started work on AI, and I started work on how we could use predictive analytics to predict things like future pandemics. And so I'm going to talk mostly today about AI, but I also want you to think that the impacts that we're having, the climate change impacts that we're having, they have much more multi-systemic impacts, including as we think about the expansion of animal agriculture into rainforests. It's not just the impact on the climate that we're having, it's also then the knock-on effects that climate change has on the health of other animals. And so if we come back to the pandemic that we had just recently, there is no habitat where a bat, a pangolin and a human being have really coexisted. There is no habitat where a bat, a pangolin and a cow have existed. And so a huge amount of the work that I do and have done over the last 30 years is looking for novel zoonoses. So looking for animal diseases that jump into human or jump from one animal to another. So I just want to put that context into the background, because it isn't in my talk and I don't know that it made the agenda today, but I just kind of want you to have a think about this. So these days I work as a futurist, and I think a lot about the use of AI. As I mentioned, I've been using it for 30 odd years, and I'm onto my 5th kind of code base with the LLMs for how we think about AI. And I just want to say, it's not the last one. We're already thinking about what forms of AI are after the LLMs, these large language models that we're using at the moment. And, a bunch of why I wanted to get into AI was that two things. One, how do pandemics move through populations? But the other one was also starting to model climate way back in the 80s. So a lot of what we think about with AI is we're thinking about more, faster, better. And I loved what Brendan said, that we've already got most of the tools that we need to deal with climate change. This is a social and psychological and anthropological thing that we need to be changing. It's human behaviour that we need to be changing. And so I want to just sort of, as a futurist, what I do is I look for little signals from the future. And I think about this often as being almost like little breadcrumbs. So if you think way back to 1989 and my professors drumming into us, it was pandemic century. You can think about working for the Ministry for the Environment in 1990 and writing these reports on climate change and on diseases. We can think about 2019 when I first started emailing my clients going, watch out, we're going to have to get our exports out of China. And then we can take a similar sort of track, and I've been emailing a lot of people over the last little while about getting their products out of the Strait of Hormuz. I was completely wrong about the date of the invasion, and so I had emailed a number of my clients and I had picked it to be 8 days earlier. And the reason that I picked it to be 8 days earlier was that I really thought that when Trump was doing his State of the Nation talk, which was on a Tuesday, that he would want to have announced the invasion before it. And so I had picked that he was going to invade on the Saturday. He, of course, didn't invade for another week. But I think if we look at this, for anyone who feels like there are shocks, you are not paying attention. These shocks have been well forecasted for a very long time. I've been working for people like the Forest Owners Association. I sit on the board of NZACC, where we're investing in energy transition. But, you know, if you kind of have a business that is dependent on fossil fuels, you're just not paying attention. And this is important, particularly for us in the food sector. Until recently, I was chair of the Lines Company in Timaru. And the reason I took that on is that 60% of the South Island's coal is used in Timaru alone. And the reason that it's used in Timaru is for food production. So it's used for process heat, for food and fibre. And when we look across the South Island, the amount of coal that is in use is enormous. And yet we think about the grid, which is largely renewables, but in the food sector, it's not just what's going on farm, it's also how we process. And then I also sit on a meat company board, and of course, we don't sell any of our product in New Zealand, which means we've got to get it to market. And getting it to market means two things. It means getting it on a ship and getting it offshore, but when we get disrupted, it also means putting it on a plane because we sell a fresh product. And so this distance from market is never going to change. And I come back to this idea that the changes are not technological, despite what I'm going to talk to you about technology. The changes are behaviour that we need to change. And I think the elephant in the room is always the one that we're going to have to destock. And people don't like us talking about destocking, but I think there are huge advantages to us destocking if what we're thinking about is higher value products. And so Atkins, where I sit on the board, you know, we measure our carbon, we're very transparent with our customers around it, we're not greenwashing by doing offsetting, we're super, super clear, but we also really believe that the highest return to the farmer is the best thing that we can do. And the highest return to the farmer doesn't mean the most animals in production. And in the lamb sector, particularly in New Zealand, you know, we have halved the number of lambs over the last 20 years and we've doubled the revenue. And I think that is worth talking about, that we need these economic solutions as well as technological solutions. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is autonomous vehicle technology. So as we start to talk about things like, you know, the distance to market, I work with a large producer of seafaring vessels. And what's so interesting here is that the demand for autonomous trucks on land and the demand for autonomous vessels at sea is really exploding. And I met with Maersk several times now over the last sort of 10 years, and they've really put their money down on low emissions transport. And so what they're doing is green ethanol. They're investing heavily in converting their ships. And again, when we think about, it's not just what we do on farm, but it's also the full supply chain. How do we get our products to market? And the combination of autonomy and electrification of fleets, I think, is going to be something that we see will help us to decrease our emissions. And at AgriTech, we're investing in hydrogen technology for aircraft, as well as, and at the moment they're small scale, but if we are going to have to air freight, as we've had to in the past, then being able to do that with much lower emissions is an important thing for us to be thinking about. This is an actual autonomous truck on the road in Texas. Texas has for a long time allowed these autonomous trucks to move particularly agricultural products and stock around, but for a long time they required them to have a person who sat in the driver's seat, and then they required someone to watch the person who was sitting in the driver's seat, which is all kind of a bit ridiculous. But even now, most of the rigs require a steering wheel. And if any of you have been to San Francisco and been in a Waymo, you know that they're driverless, but the law requires them to have a steering wheel. And in New Zealand, there's been quite an impediment to some of these autonomous vehicles. Christchurch Airport bought one and they couldn't use it because you have to have the rego on the front. And because it didn't have a steering wheel, it didn't have a front or a back. And so it got stuck in this like endless loop of regulatory chaos. And so you can see like often the technology is well ahead of our legislators and we need to keep pushing that. But I do think that the electrification of fleets, the electrification of trucks and the changes to autonomy, because why is autonomous important? Autonomous is important because of two things. One is that there's millions of hours of research now around the autonomous vehicles, and they are 96% safer than a human behind the wheel. And so we've now had 4 deaths from autonomous cars on the roads. That's less than there is a day in San Francisco from people behind the wheel. And then the other side of it is that autonomous vehicles are way more fuel efficient. People aren't braking and changing gears and doing all of those things. And so there is a link here with what might not seem like a climate piece of tech, but these technologies will continue to reduce emissions as we go forward. So, here they are in traffic. Obviously, there's a person in there just filming. But one of the things I want you to think about, as a futurist, I kind of have this idea that the present is messy and contradictory. And what I mean by that is that there isn't really one present out there today. There are farms who are really reducing their emissions and there are farms who are not. There are customers who want particular kinds of attributes and there are customers who don't. And we often people come to me and they go, Melissa, what's the future of the kitchen? Or what's the future of dairy? And I just want to say, there isn't one. Just like there's not one present, there isn't one future out there. So to me, one of the most interesting technologies, and I am going to focus on the use of AI in these technologies, has been the development of the human bioidentical lactoferrin. And I can see a few people, hi Tracy and a few others, that have heard me speak now over maybe 5 or 10 years about some of these developments. And for a while there, Helena, this company, what it was trying to do was to build a completely bioidentical human milk product for infant formula. And it turns out that human milk is incredibly complex and quite difficult to replicate. But this is an important thing to be thinking about, which is that the lactoferrin has turned out to be the easiest of the compounds within human milk to replicate. And so it's getting to a point where it's almost cheaper now to make it in a vat than it is to make it in a cow. And not only is it cheaper to make it in a vat, so what you do is you feed carbohydrate, probably something like sugarcane, into a vat with a whole lot of specialised microbes, and the lactoferrin comes out, and it's exactly, it's undetectable. If you put the human, produced in a woman, alongside produced in a vat, you can't tell the difference. Now, obviously, we can tell the difference quite a bit between what was produced in a cow and what was produced in a woman. And so this idea of being able to get bioidentical is quite important. The emissions of that at the beginning were quite high and are starting to come down markedly as more and more solar is in use in those factories. Does that make sense? So at the beginning, many of them were also using fossil fuels to run their biodigesters, and now they've moved to solar technology. So I think this is worth looking at because it converges with a human issue, which is that all over the world, the birth rate is dropping. And New Zealand has largely been able to grow its dairy industry on the back of growth in China of population. And we know that China's population has peaked. We also know that population has peaked in virtually every developed economy. It's only growing in Africa, really. And this is important as we think about where our markets are for our traditional products. And this is where I think destocking, but creating higher value products is an important way for us to be thinking. We also see the use of AI. John Deere is a company that I admire a lot. I know there's a lot of problematic stuff with them too, but in 2016 they announced a new strategy, 2016. And what they said was that they no longer wanted to sell hardware, which is basically their big kit. What they wanted to do was to pivot to being a data company. Now it's taken them a long time, but they are one of the world's largest investors in autonomy, and remember their autonomous vehicles are much more fuel efficient. On top of that, they're heavily invested in solar, and they now can operate any one of their pieces of kit from Montana remote, and they can sell you a retrofit kit. And what they want to do is not sell equipment. They want to sell like sowing as a service, reaping as a service, and basically lease the equipment out in the future and take on that kind of software model. And I think this is particularly useful because they want to be able to run everything remote. They have been working on all of this vision technology for a very long time. In particular, what they're looking at as one of their big targets is the reduction in herbicide use. But similarly, they're also targeting, like many other companies, the reduction in the use of fossil fuel-derived fertilisers. And I think it's so fascinating that this week in New Zealand we're talking about taking, South Island coal and converting that to fertiliser. It just doesn't feel like the future. And so this idea of there are multiple technologies, Ravensdown is another one that is looking at how do you reduce the farm inputs, how do you target exactly where those fertilisers need to go. But even more importantly to me are people like FarmWise, which are saying, actually, let's, instead of applying pesticides and fertilisers, why don't we really understand moment by moment what that soil is like or what that weed is like, and we just target that one and we don't apply anything to it. We literally just zap it or rip it out. And I think more and more of these technologies are coming. Here in New Zealand, we've got Prism, who's doing some fantastic work with being able to take farm data and give you really good insights as to what to do with it. And I liked what Brendan had to say before, is that data is not the answer. Having been in tech so long, people kept telling me, we just need the data and then we're going to commercialise the data. And if you hear that from someone, you know that they're stuck in an old business model. They don't understand that data is actually not what's valuable. It's the insight that's valuable. And we need to be thinking about those insights. Similarly, there's AIMA, which you can scan with your phone and understand your pasture cover and where you might need to do work. Corteva has its Carl product, which again uses AI to really focus very deeply on what is required at the sort of sub-acre, sub-hectare level. We've also seen the growth of vertical farms. Arama Kukutai, some of you may know, who's a friend of mine, who's the CEO of Plenty, where this photo comes from. And we're seeing this growth of vertical farming. And what has been the kicker that has made these vertical farms successful is that they have solar on the roof. And that ability to grow vegetables at source, so they grow them in the car parks at Walmart, and they're literally cutting them and walking them. I've got to stop, but I've got 2 last slides and I'm going to run through them. The other one is that AI is really helping us to understand language in a way that we may not have before. And what worries me a bit about our current AI is we're basically taking the intelligence of some 24-year-old geek boys, tech bros in California, and we're doubling down on that. And there's some cool work being done, particularly on petunias, where they are starting to analyse the way that plants talk to each other. And petunias in particular, what they do is that if a pest arrives, they send messages to all the other petunias in the neighbourhood that there is that a pest has turned up, and then they put up their defences, which I think is really interesting. And I know you want me to talk about AI, but for those of you who farm, you're smarter with a dog. Okay, and I keep thinking, why are we AIing the tech bros and why aren't we AIing the dog? Because I would be much smarter with the AI of a dog on my farm than I am with the AI of a tech bro. Does that make sense? And it's the same. Maybe we should be harnessing the intelligence of the land in a better way, not us thinking what the land's trying to say to us, but can we AI the land back to us in a form that we can understand? Can we be really AIing other species? Why aren't we asking the whale what it wants us to know about the ocean rather than us just trying to double down on our own intelligence? And I'll leave you with this idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa.
You're welcome.
As if we needed further proof that we're messy and complex. I'm very comfortable with the idea of harnessing the intelligence of a kelpie, but that photo of the driverless truck on a motorway absolutely gave me the heebie-jeebies. So perhaps some work to do on my prejudices. Now, I'm hoping we're also going to be joined by Hayden. I think he's standing by on the video link. But either way, we've got some fantastic questions here for all of you. I'm going to start with a very big picture question. Global instability around geopolitics and trade are pushing farming businesses to consider longer-term strategic risk investment. So far, so good. But in an unstable world, it can be dangerous to be only optimised for immediate efficiencies when the highest value investments might not gain immediate efficiencies. Do either of you have any insight into how we balance these tensions? It's a big question.
Look, I think no one farms for the short term. And so, whether it's intergenerational businesses, whether it's kaupapa Māori thinking about, how we're going to keep this farm going forever, I think that actually farmers are pretty good at investing for the long term. We know that a fence doesn't last. You're not doing it just for one season or something. I think what's been tricky, two things. So the sociological bit that I think is tricky is if you're the weirdo in your neighbourhood who does something new on farm, you can get a bit of flack at the pub on a Friday night, or you can get flack from your farmer kind of conversation group or support groups. And I think what's really hard is knowing which ones are genius and which ones are loony. And so I do think that we have to support some of those mavericks who try new things. But I also think there's a role for producer boards, for the meat companies, for Fonterra and others, in investing ahead to show demonstration ways of farming in the future, or demonstrations that give people a bit more courage to try putting their money down on something that they may not know whether it's going to make a return.
Perhaps before we know what's the loony and what's the maverick, give them both a crack.
Yeah.
Brendan?
Melissa, I really liked your point earlier on that, sort of the future is going to be just as contradictory and messy as the present is. So that's true. And so none of the geopolitical things that we're seeing right now are novel, as you also pointed out. There's been signals and signs of them, and the reality is, things can always get worse, and things will get worse. Which is why when I think about the combination of tools and skills and attitudes that we've got, that they become the way of doing things that we can apply to different problems in the future as well. So making decisions about what to do on farm now is still around, trying to have more insights, better visibility about what's going on, and a couple of more control mechanisms and levers. And so anything that gives you more options and more control or insights over that in your current situation over the next few years will stand to you when you need to pivot and do something different with those concepts and insights later on. And again, it's that law of requisite variety, whichever subsystem has the most flexibility will control the system. So just having more flexibility around what we do and insights, I think, can be applied when the crisis changes and we need to respond differently. It's still going to be, what's the community around you? How do you respond to that? What are the tools and assets that you've got to try and respond in those new conditions?
I was very late to watching The Diplomat on Netflix, but I noticed that they predicted a crisis in the Strait of Hormuz many, many years ago.
Yeah. Can I just add something onto that? I think it's really important that we take a consumer view as well. Ultimately, our consumers pay us to farm. And often I think what we do is we think about how we'd like to do it, and then we think they should understand. And I think there's something here about really understanding what the market will pay for and what it won't pay for, and what it's interested in. And so coming back to quick fixes, I suppose I worry a bit about vaccines, not because I'm anti-vaccine, but because I wonder if our consumers are going to be excited about that. And for me, sometimes I loved your challenge around are we asking the right question, because sometimes I feel like the question around climate change is how can we keep farming the way we're farming, or a vaccine will help us with that, or some GMOs might help us with that. But that's not the same as kind of thinking, well, how do I really think about long term? How do I really think about being able to continue to farm long term? How do I think about long term food production and producing food that my customers want? And so again, I'm not anti-GMO, I want to be super clear here, but if our customers don't want it, I also suspect there's going to be a large customer base that don't want vaccines. And so we have to be also thinking about that as we come up with solutions.
The size of the toolbox is perhaps going to be important here too. Hayden, a specific question for you. How should we think about how the Global Methane Hub fits alongside and works with our own domestic institutions, like the Ag Emissions Centre, AgriZero, etc.? And then there's a second question here, closely related. What opportunities do you see for collaborating between New Zealand and the GMH?
Great, thank you. I think, well, we do, is the short answer. We are in regular contact with the New Zealand Ag Emissions Centre. You may have recognised one of the faces on our Science Oversight Committee is actually based there, which is also great. And with AgriZero, likewise, we have regular catch-ups. If not in person, when we see each other in conferences, we make efforts to do that, as on today, virtually. And concretely, look, there are projects funded in the context of the Accelerator initiative I presented that are jointly funded by ourselves and the New Zealand system, New Zealand Ag Emissions Centre and others, particularly, projects that require, significant research capability, infrastructure, and just generally resources because of the nature of those projects, right? And I'm talking here about long-term trials with animals, probably some of the more expensive kind of research one can conduct, at least in the methane space. We have projects underway in New Zealand, jointly funded by ourselves and by that New Zealand system. So, and I think you'll probably hear a little bit more detail later on one of those. And on the GRA, I mentioned the scholarships that we support as part of that GRA Cliff Grades initiative. But beyond that, look, a number of our projects also are what you'd characterise as flagship projects of the Global Research Alliance. And we're always, we don't want to create new institutions, right? Like, we are a funder and we're trying to catalyse and accelerate. So where there exists long-standing deep networks of scientists, well-established, well-organised, that often are starved for resources, we see ourselves as having a complementary role. So a number of the projects we fund are actually delivered through the networks and the research groups of the Global Research Alliance. And the intention is for that to be an ongoing activity, right? More and more projects of that nature, making the most of those well-established networks.
Thanks, Hayden. Hard pivot here for Melissa, but still on methane. Considering how much energy AI takes to run, how can we use this to mitigate methane, given that energy use is a primary source of methane emissions? Now, I'm reading a bit in here, but I'm assuming that the question asker is talking about the methane emitted from oil and gas drilling. And this is a very popular question, so a lot of interest in this.
Yeah, I mean, look, AI data centres absolutely chug power, and I don't think there's any way around that at this moment in time. So I don't really have an answer for you, and at this moment we're not seeing, like, even the one that they're looking at putting down in the South Island, I don't think they're talking about putting solar on the roof to run it, which I just find baffling. So I don't really have an answer.
Well, if we had long-term infrastructure plans in New Zealand, which would be a novelty in itself, we probably could start thinking about this. As you pointed out, the 85% of our renewable energy sources and how that could be deployed into green data centres, and that would be a great national strategy with global meaning. We just don't currently think in those terms right now.
No arguments from the stage. A question for all three, please. Which tools and technologies do you see as most promising for supporting low emissions farming in New Zealand, and what is being done to bring them to farmers faster?
All of them. I'm not even joking. It's, again, I think back to Richard Heath's presentation yesterday and what zero net agriculture in Australia is looking at, and it's a whole farm systems approach. It's not a technology; it's a technology stack, and it's a combination of all the tools that are currently available, but not necessarily widely adopted, as well as the new tools that are going to come on and sit on top of that. So we can pick out particular tools that sound particularly sexy or powerful, but it's a whole system approach that's going to be required.
What about the adoption part of that question? Because you did touch on that. What's being done already? Anything you think is particularly effective?
I think there's more that can be done there. So, I know there's a question coming through there as well, and I'll make a liar of myself now to say I don't want to be commenting always on Ireland and New Zealand participants, but there was a question around some concerted efforts in Ireland to both improve productivity outcomes and do some education and training, and including grants for technologies in terms of, and likewise for emissions. There's various activities going on. In that particular ecosystem and across a lot of other ecosystems, that's done in a really centralized, government first type way. Subsidies has been a dirty word here in New Zealand, and I think it's good that it's a dirty word, because there's the lack of direct subsidies has probably created a strength and a capability here that we want to build on. But I do think it's time that we recognise that there's more to be done, and there are different ways of encouraging different levels of adoption. I know that's work that AgriZero are beginning to lean into more. I know that's work that people like the Ignition team and Ravensdown are looking at with their Farm Innovation Network. I think if we look at coupling up those type of infrastructures and capabilities, yes, we could increase the rates of adoption, which are already pretty good for some of the reasons that I mentioned, but need to be greater. If we had on our double export by value battle cry, if we just had better adoption, a lot of the productivity tools that are currently available in the market, well, we'd see a 20-30% lift straight away in terms of our export values.
And is there a lot of your AI tools where efficiency?
I think there's some of that, but I would come back to like the economic model, which is if we can destock and make more money, that to me changes the game quite differently. And then the other piece of it, I think the other one is that, we've done it a bunch of it, like on farm, feed in equals methane out. So this productivity stuff, if we can be far more productive, and I don't just mean like the animal itself being more productive, but on the same amount of feed, if we can have farmers make a lot more money on that kilo of feed, that also helps to reduce the emissions. And I feel like we go to fixing things rather than taking, as Brendan's talking about, a systems-wide approach. And so, I'm using AI every day in my daily life, and I am a big supporter of these systems that are using everything. So how do we reduce fertiliser use on farm? How do we reduce fossil fuel use on farm? How do we also, right through the supply chain, take the fossil fuel out, including our shipping and air freight? I think we have to do all of those. But to me, the one that's going to go, it's business model change affects far faster change than technological change. And I see that across every industry.
I think, the destocking question in particular for me, that's not about removing options, that's about choosing other options.
Yeah.
It's a systems approach to sort of saying, we're not taking something away, we're seeing better value and better options there. And I don't think we've created enough options for New Zealand.
Yeah, I agree.
We're here sitting in a country that's still driven by agriculture as its main piece. We should celebrate that as a good thing, but we need additional options.
Yeah.
We need other pieces.
But I think our agricultural future is really bright. So I'm not one of those people who goes, it's a sunset industry or anything. I truly don't believe that, I believe that our future is in food production and in fibre production, but we need to find a way to have that elevate the returns to a point that it's just a no-brainer to continue to invest in those businesses.
And it can become part of a knowledge economy for us
Totally.
as well, because the knowledge we've got is based on our agricultural capabilities. So how do we switch that into, AgriTech being a vertical of an output from our industries?
I could keep this going for an hour, but we only have a minute, and I want to hear from Hayden because he's got this global view. Any particular technologies and things that you're seeing to get those on farms?
I would just go back to the chart that I showed that Brendan mentioned in his talk with the sort of curve, bending the curve and then the flat line. I want to be clear that in every one of those dots on that plot, that's an average for a country somewhere in the world, right? Within a dot, you'll see another curve. And so I absolutely agree with Brendan that we are definitely not maximising the opportunities that exist with technologies or management or knowledge that is out there that is just not scale enough. And I think it's unfortunate, to be honest, that given the nature of this topic and the maybe, gender politics that was discussed yesterday, it's kind of been a situation of, reduce all emissions or nothing, to be slightly provocative. And I feel like we've perhaps missed an opportunity to be much more deliberate and explicit about the role that the productivity story, for shorthand, plays, right? The optimization, the efficient feed conversion that Melissa's been talking about, improving animal health, right? Incidence of mastitis, making these connections between good old productivity and this methane challenge as well, because it's relevant to New Zealand and it's certainly relevant to many of the developing countries that were showing a reddish color on my figures that I presented. And it's those things stacking then other things on top, right? Or changing, as has been mentioned, right? Farmers have options, they can make decisions. So I think the debate's been too sort of black and white and not enough embracing all of the solutions and thinking of the whole system.
Hayden, thank you so much. We have got such a list of good questions here. This happens every time. But this has been an incredibly interesting panel for me. Thank you, three of you, for your time. It is time for morning tea. Please don't forget to check out Z's visual capture of the conference so far. Please be seated back again by 10:30 a.m. You will hear the moo. And one more reminder, we do still have seats free at the front of the room. So if you're standing and feeling uncomfortable, do come forward, don't be shy. See you back soon.